presentation because I'm now a cripple. I mean, I'm an official cripple because I got my handicap placard, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, there's a common knee-jerk response when people hear of an atheist church. Maybe some of us had that too. You know, people think well, churches are supposed to worship God. Atheists can't have a church, and even atheists may be puzzled, doubtful that atheists can have anything worthwhile to say or do in a church of their own. And in fact, it's been suggested many times over the years, why do you call yourself a church? You should change your name and so forth. Well, our name actually has a lot to do with what we're doing. Here's Bill Maher. He says atheism is a religion like abstinence is a sex position. So this might seem discouraging. Like I said, some of us wonder maybe it's not the right thing to call ourselves a church, or to doubt that our core values of relying on facts and reason for making sense of everything can be, for us, our religion. But I don't think we should be discouraged. I don't think we should be doubtful. That's not warranted, and this relates to something very important to us in the United States, which is religious freedom and the separation of state and church that are guaranteed in our Constitution's First Amendment, which reads like this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But of course there's a tension in these words. And maybe it's not obvious, but it is this. What is religion? What legally is and is not religion? And you may think you know what it is, but the Constitution doesn't say. And isn't that a dangerous thing, after all, for the government to say this is religion and this is not? That really would kind of be a violation of the very guarantee that our government is to stay out of and aloof from religion if it were to define religion. And even today we have, for example, we have people running around saying Islam's not a religion, that's a political ideology for taking over the world. Islam deserves no protection under the First Amendment. There are people, go look it up on Google if you don't believe me, who are seriously saying that. And if Bill Maher's joke were to be taken seriously by the Supreme Court, of course, atheists would not enjoy any protections with respect to our religious liberties. Fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has taken a different course. While not strictly defining religion, it said more than 50 years ago that religion should be taken to include, as I have quoted here, a sincere and meaningful belief occupying in the life of its possessor a place parallel to that filled by the God of theistic religions. That was in a military exemption for religion case back in 1965 called Seeger. Very interesting thing to look up. Actually, all the Supreme Court decisions are very readable and educational. But in this particular decision, the court took notice of and quoted the thought of theologian Paul Tillich, who actually died in 1965. And here's what Tillich said. And if that word, this is quoted in the Supreme Court decision, if that word, God, has not much meaning for you, translate it and speak of the depths of your life, of the source of your being, of your ultimate concern, of what you take seriously without any reservation. Perhaps in order to do so, you must forget everything traditional that you have learned about God. And this is why we should not be discouraged when people misunderstand the concept of an atheist church, for it only shows how great is the need for people to reconceptualize religion and its meaning, as Tillich suggested. The very idea that church is about, and religion is about worshiping God, or praying, or pretending that when we die, people really live on somehow. All those things are like the fairy tales of childhood. They're amusing fictions, perhaps. We all enjoy fairy tales as small children, but those things have to be set aside in order to live as grown-ups in the real world and deal with real-world problems, which are very difficult and painful, as we know. And of course, we also know that denial, besides being a river in Egypt, is a sort of defense mechanism against scary and undesirable things, but maturity means facing those threats. It means recognizing the urgent need to reduce the amount of misery to which we are subject and find ways to increase and enhance our satisfaction with an appreciation of our brief lives and of each other. We know that the best ideas can languish when people are conditioned not to even understand them. Yet Tillich's thinking and associated ideas on which the NTCOF is rooted all on our websites, not like we make any secret of it, those things aren't new. Even Martin Luther once said, this is back in the 16th century, Whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really your God. There remains an open question as to which direction our society and the world is going to go with respect to religion, but people who do not grasp what the real issues are and especially what the stakes are not living in the 21st century. You'll see how this relates to our topic of heresy. Now, I said a moment ago that it's March 5th. Who's ever heard of the Sasanian Empire? Have you ever heard of the Sasanian Empire? You're a student of history, Roman, also called the Sassanid Empire. Okay, or the Neo-Persian Empire. It was Alicia Navaz was here. That was one reason I was going to be looking for her. She's our member from Persia. Well, this is an empire that existed for over 400 years alongside the Roman Byzantine Empire. In fact, it was the chief rival of the Byzantine Empire. The connection with March 5th is that on that date in 363, the Roman Emperor Julian moved from Antioch to attack the empire. Unsuccessfully, and in fact, he was killed in battle during that campaign. But Julian turns out to have been an interesting character, and according to Wikipedia, Julian was a man of unusually complex character. He was military commander, theosophist, social reformer, man of letters. He was also the last non-Christian ruler of the Roman Empire, and while he was in power, attempted to revive traditional Roman religious practices at the expense of Christianity. Remember, this is after Constantine. And that caused Julian to be remembered as Julian the Apostate by the church, and there's artwork of Julian being stomped and killed by Saint Mercurius and all sorts of stuff. The church really hated him. He was the last emperor of the Constantinian dynasty, the empire's first Christian dynasty. But you see, it's okay to be a heretic when you're an emperor. On March 5th, 1616, Copernicus' book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres was placed on the Vatican's list of prohibited books. That list got started up somewhere around the 9th century. It didn't become official until a little while after that. And the final edition appeared in 1948 before being finally abolished in 1966 by Pope Paul VI. And that certainly ties in with the subject of heresy, doesn't it? It's just funny how everything all relates to everything else. March 5th of 1770 was the date of the Boston Massacre, when 5 people were killed by British soldiers. The soldiers being attacked by a mob. Does that look like the soldiers are under attack? No, that's an artist's conception afterwards. These were considered the first casualties of the American Revolution. 8 soldiers, 1 officer, and 4 civilians were prosecuted and defended by John Adams, the second president of the United States. They were all acquitted, but for 2 soldiers that were convicted of manslaughter. They were punished by getting their thumbs branded. The massacre is considered a turning point in colonial sentiment towards British rule. This, our artist's conception really made a big difference that way. John Adams later wrote that, quote, "The foundation of American independence was laid on March 5th, 1770. On a less happy note, March 5th of 1933 saw the Nazis get 43.9% of the votes in the Reichstag elections. Later that month, with the help of legislators and smaller parties and a lot of intimidation and violence, Hitler was given dictatorial powers, and the rest, as they say, is history. Look how quickly things moved. Hitler became chancellor on January 31st of that year. Prior to the end of February, the arson at the Reichstag happened. The building burned, and they blamed communists and convinced people that this was near basically the end of their country unless they elected the Nazis. March 5th, a few days later, had the elections, and on March 23rd, the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler these dictatorial powers, was passed. And that's something to keep in mind. You know, the big hazard is when things move this quickly, it's not a good thing. So, birthdays. Lynn Margulis was born on this day in 1938. She died in 2011. Have you ever heard of this woman?
No.
Too bad, you should. So we're going to tell you. She was the evolutionary scientist who gained recognition for asserting that intracellular organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts were once free-living bacteria, and that symbiosis played a very significant role in evolution. So it shows how the prokaryotic cells get incorporated into and then live out their lives. We are assemblages of cells that all have mitochondria. Unfortunately, not chloroplasts. Maybe that would solve the problem of world hunger if we could figure out how to put chloroplasts in us. Of course, it would turn us green, but a small price to pay. You just go out in the sun and soak up your calories. Appropriately enough, Margulis was called, among other things, is a vindicated heretic. Came across that relates to our subject today for advancing this position, which she was not the first, but she was the one who drove it through, and it is now well-established science that that's how we get these organelles in our body. Like any good scientist, though, especially when straying from one's area of greatest expertise, she sometimes got it wrong when, for example, she said that the 9/11 attacks were a false flag operation and that the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings were a controlled demolition. So people make mistakes, even great scientists. Margulis was married to Carl Sagan from 1957 to 1964. They had 2 sons together. And yes, like Sagan, she was an atheist, agnostic. This is Penn Jillette's birthday. You all know who he is, right? Yeah. How many have read his books? He's got other ones too. Yeah, this is all, God, no. And then he's got some other books, a lot of magic type of things like this, Penn and Teller's card tricks. So, moving on, our church has a creed. This is one of many ways of putting it, a succinct version of our principles, which we can say is real religion and spirituality. And each of these items, each of these bulleted items could be greatly expanded on and have been by a variety of thinkers and writers over human history, some of the most brilliant people that have ever lived. Freethought understood as puzzling over how to make sense of the subjective human condition, that experience that we can't really share with others other than to describe it. And to do that without supernaturalism, that's been a concern of really some of the most brilliant minds that we've ever had. Much of the work is done, but the ideas need to be pulled together and made relevant for our lives today, and that is what we try to do at the Church of Freethought. So today, we have some great material on heresy, and you can see some of our past services on YouTube, thanks to the efforts of John Coaching, who's back there videoing us today. Also, Sarah and Rusty Nadel, who are not here today, but they get all the credit for our amazing website. Also, where there's a forum under the services section, feel free to go there. There's some jokes, most some religious jokes. I've always thought it'd be great to have a huge treasury of Freethought atheist-related jokes. You do have to sign up for the forums. It's easy, but it's just to keep out the bots and spammers. And go to our Facebook page. Where are you, Aaron? There you are. Came in over on that side. So Aaron's been our Facebook conjurer, and I appreciate the interesting things you put on there. And so go there and like it, get updates on our meetings. The URLs are all on page 2 of the bulletin. And so is information about the NTCOF Book Club, which meets later this month. This is a classic book from the 1970s. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. All about kind of the journey of self-discovery that happens in psychotherapy and hopefully in life. That's going to be held at Linda Koshy's home, and her address is again in the bulletin and on the meetup site. Our service next month will be another must because we'll be considering why we or anyone should be reasonable. I mean, what's wrong with making a leap of faith, as we're urged to do by believers? Well, as Archie Bunker put it, faith is something that you believe that nobody in his right mind would believe. You have to think about Archie Bunker saying it. So we'll talk about what's wrong with that on April 2nd, 4 weeks from today. So I was going to say that Merlin Michaud is with our younger freethinkers today, but just when we brought kids, that just happened. So we'll put you on tap for next month. Just put it in mothballs and have that for next month. We'll see that. But our children are truly the future. We really do need additional people to be with the kids. Just rotate once a month, work with them. Just try it for a month. Some of you would be interested, and it's a great way to share yourself, to learn from them too. They need to learn, and you need to show and teach them how important and exciting it is to think and experience, as Richard Feynman put it, the pleasure of finding things out. And especially the pleasure of finding out that lots of people are reasonable people. They don't believe in God and all that nonsense. So next we have John Goche. He's going to come up and leave the camera going, so we'll catch you. Talk about, there's always so many things for the moment of science, and this is going to be more than a moment just because there's so much in this. And John is kind of our astronomer go-to guy. He's going to be going to see the total eclipse of the sun in August, so I'll let John take it away. You just, there's a little forward button to go from slide to the next.
I've got that first. just to let you know, what Tim did say is anybody who's in this group who wants to present something interesting is free to volunteer and come up here.
Absolutely. Get your name on the program.
Exactly. Could be related to atheism, could be unrelated to atheism. But I think the topics of science are, we have this moment of science that most of our services.
Right.
So this is a good place to fill in here. This will be more than a moment, but you said I could go ahead and take more time than usual.
There's a lot here.
All right, so what is the TRAPPIST-1 system? It's a new solar system recently discovered, and it's like, well, we've been discovering an awful lot of extrasolar planets recently, but this one's kind of special, as you'll see. What is TRAPPIST? It is a horrible acronym, actually. That stands for Transiting Planets and Planetesimals Small Telescopes. So all the letters don't even match up here, but it's a system of 2 telescopes. They're considered small, although most people here, they're pretty big. One is in Morocco. That's their North Observatory. That's 50 kilometers south of Morocco. The other one is in near Santiago, Chile, near 600 kilometers north. Okay. So this system that they discovered is primarily initiated by discoveries with these 2 telescopes that are dedicated to finding extrasolar planets. Well, where is TRAPPIST-1? TRAPPIST-1 is a small star located in the constellation of Aquarius. Here you see on this map. It was discovered, the star was discovered in 1999, very dim star. And the additional planets orbiting this star were not discovered until 3 of them discovered in 2015, and the last 4 were discovered and announced last month. Here's a comparison between the Sun and TRAPPIST-1. You can see that TRAPPIST-1 is a very, very small star. It is only of 8% of the mass of the Sun. It's a what they call an ultra-cool red dwarf. Doesn't mean it's from a fashionable area of the galaxy, but it means that it is very, very cool. Its temperature is only 2,500 degrees Kelvin at its surface, as opposed to our Sun, which is over twice that temperature, at least 10 degrees Kelvin. Other comparisons here, you can see our Sun is almost 1 million miles in diameter, and the TRAPPIST-1 is about a tenth of that. Class is spectral class. The letters O, B, A, F, G. Let's see, O, B, A, fine girl, kiss me. There's a mnemonic to remember those letters. O stars are very hot blue stars, and at the other end of the spectrum is your M class stars, which are very cool and red. The Sun is a G2 star, which is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. In terms of age, our sun is about 4.6 billion years old, and will probably have a lifespan of greater than 12 billion years before it burns out all its nuclear fuel. It's very hard to judge the age of the TRAPPIST-1 star that is believed to be a somewhat young star, but only greater than 500 million years old, but it could be somewhat greater than sun. But because it is so small stars burn their nuclear fuel up very slowly. It could be 12 trillion years before TRAPPIST-1 eventually burns out. TRAPPIST-1 is actually only slightly larger than Jupiter. It's 84 times more massive. Well, it's because that gravitation that's necessary to ignite nuclear fuel, the star has to be very dense, to be hot enough to ignite. So then once it ignites, it blows off all the remaining matter that was there, that was part of its formation. As they discover planets around these stars, they letter them starting at B. I guess that A is reserved because that's the star itself. So they start B, C, D, and so on. I believe it's an order of discovery, but the TRAPPIST system, the closest one to the star is B, then C, D, and so on going outward. So I'm not real sure about the nomenclature here and about how they assign those. You can see the comparison in size between Jupiter's moons, our planets, and you can see most of the TRAPPIST planets are about close to the size of Earth, Venus. Here's some more statistics on each of these planets. Of course, this is the thing I hate about some of these programs and things you see on the web, is the first thing that they're tempted to do is, let's go find an artist and draw what the planet must look like. Well, we have no idea that the planets look anything like this, all right? This is just to kind of make things a little bit more interesting to draw people and get them interested in science, right? but the numbers are real. The numbers are actually, based on observation, calculation, prediction, and so on. You can see that the B planet only takes 1.5 days to go around its star, and we'll show you why in a minute. The one that's farthest out takes 20 days. And of course, compared to our system, Mercury takes 90 days to go once around the sun. Well, if you know anything about the relation between the period of a planet's orbit and the size of its orbit, you can see that the entire TRAPPIST system fits well within the orbit. It would, if you put it in the middle of our solar system, would fit well within the orbit of Mercury, this tiny little spot right down here. All right, so it's an extremely small system. If you look at the discovery rate of exoplanets, the first confirmed exoplanet was discovered in 1992. Most of these are being discovered by what they call a transit method, where if a planet happens to pass directly between us and the host star in terms of line of sight, we can detect that dip in brightness of the host star. So, but now there are getting close to 4,000 exoplanets confirmed as of March of this year. All right, the smallest one goes down to only 2 times the mass of the moon, and the largest is 29 times the mass of Jupiter. Although there's some debate as to whether or not, well, is that really a planet or is a brown dwarf, a sort of an almost star, right? So it kind of gets a little bit nebulous there in the classification. There's many different techniques that they're using now to discover these exoplanets. Radial velocity is where you watch the host star, and if you have a big enough planet, you can see as the planet goes around, if it's a big gas giant, it'll tug the star either way. It's sort of a mutual, instead of the planet orbiting around the star, it's big enough that the two are really kind of orbiting around each other. So you can see that in the motion back and forth. Gravitational microlensing, I don't know if they're using that a whole lot, but they can detect the variation in the light path that causes sort of a shift when the light passes by a massive object, like it does with our sun, for example. Direct imaging, that can be done to only the biggest stars, because even the most powerful telescopes right now can just barely resolve the disk of the biggest, closest star. So that's not very common. There's polarimetry, astrometry, I haven't looked into those. Transit photometry is the one we're talking about. That is by far the most common technique being used, and that's the one they used here. And then there's timing variations, like, for example, if the planet is orbiting a pulsar, it can actually affect the timing of pulses on the pulsar. So that was kind of obscure. The Kepler Space Telescope is the telescope that is doing most of the work right now. They basically look at an area of the sky that has hundreds of thousands of stars in it, and just look at it for a really long time and watch for those dips in brightness as planets happen to pass between their host star and us. They have so far have almost 5,000 candidates. They have to wait sometimes long enough for another transit to occur, maybe multiple times, so they can say, yep, it's happening periodically, that must be a planet. So they're waiting on confirmation on some of them. Kepler has confirmed 2,331 planets so far. Well, more about the technique, transit light curves here. What happens when a planet passes between us and its host star. You have to keep in mind that because we can't actually see an image of the disk of the star in almost all of these cases, all right, that you're really basically just looking at one point of light and watching the brightness of that point of light as it goes up and down. So it's really impressive that they can actually do this. But when you think about what's going on, there's actually a lot more information that can be gleaned, because you look at the depth of this curve. The depth at this point D here actually determines the diameter of the planet relative to the host star, the percentage of light that it is obscuring. This is why TRAPPIST, the people who run the TRAPPIST system, were looking particularly at very small stars. Because if you've got an Earth-sized planet, it's pretty hard to pick it out against a really big star in terms of the percentage of brightness. The percentage of the star that it's covering is actually very small. But the smaller the star, the greater the percentage, so the greater the dip in the light. You can see that's at the bottom of the curve. So this dashed red line here has to do with the limb darkening, is that when you have a uniformly radiant globe, it's radiating light in all directions, when you're looking at it, you don't see the same intensity of light all the way across. You see the brightest part in the middle, and at the edges, it's much dimmer. So that's why this curve doesn't actually meet, the sort of geometrical curve that would otherwise see here. If you watch long enough, you'll see these dips over a period of time. And if you see them at regular intervals, that regular interval you're seeing is a period of the planet's orbit. Once you know the period of the planet's orbit, if you have an estimate of the mass of the star, you can calculate the distance from the star from those two parameters. This is an example of the first transit light curves measured by Kepler for planets that it discovered, Kepler 4b, 5b, 6b, right? These were all, and you can see the different characteristics of these curves, right? You can see that the depth of the curve is different depending on the size of the planet associated with it. This one they almost didn't get it all. Tiny little thing there, right? But of course, for the bigger planets, they got a deeper curve. All right. Also, the width of the curve, of course, is related to the period and how long it takes. You can see that the ones that are 3.2 days are narrower because they're going faster. They cross the star's surface faster than the others that are wider, that are further out. There's a simulation of what it would look like if we put some kind of spacecraft way out and we looked at planets that were crossing the line of sight from that observation for, say, Jupiter, Neptune, and Earth. Right? Jupiter would cover a sizable percentage of the solar disk, and you'd see a deep curve down there in blue. Right? Neptune, not so much. Right? You'd see a little dip here. Earth would be almost down to noise. You probably couldn't see it at all. It was an extremely sensitive instrument. This is the actual data for the TRAPPIST-1 system that they measured over time. And you can see we've got 1b, 1c, 1d. Those are the planets in terms of the closest to farthest. They only have one reading for the H planet, so they don't really know its period as of yet, because they don't have another sample yet, but they'll just keep watching, and they'll eventually get enough data to determine that. You can see these little data points here for the B planet, here. You can see how they line those up, all right? Here's the data alongside that graphic of the planets here, and you can see the depth of the curves from the closest star to the farthest star, all right? As the width widens, it's taking longer and longer for that planet to obscure the disk. And then, of course, the depth of the curve gives you an indication of how big the planet is. You can see that the B planet has got a pretty deep curve. All right, it's the biggest of them. The smallest of them is H, and you can see the depth of that curve is pretty small. There's also a graphic here that kind of shows you the relative orbits from their distance from the star. There's a few little nits in the data that they had to work out. Occasionally there's so many, with that many planets going that frequently around the star, you get some complex interactions here within multiple transits, right? So here's shows a case where they had up to 3 planets involved in a single transit, right? The first two coming in at about the same time, all right? And then the third one showing up, adding a little dip to the curve, all right? And then as they exit the other side, you can see the curve ramps back up the other side. So they had to actually look at that and wait a minute, something's not quite right. There may be more than one planet here in this transit. Now there's, whoops, and Tyler messed up a little bit. This system is one of the best systems we have so far that demonstrates something called orbital resonance. And that is where the period of, because of gravitational effects, that the period of the planet's orbits actually tends to be in terms of the ratios of small integer numbers, all right? So, for example, if you look at Jupiter's moons, Io, Europa, and Ganymede are related to each other. If you look at the size of their orbits, almost perfectly positioned at ratios of 1 to 2 to 4, right? For one time you go around with one moon, you go twice the other, and 4 with the other. Well, that's because if their orbits are related in this fashion, when they come around, they have lots of occurrences where they, at the same point in the closest approach to the planet, their perihelion, all right? They happen to hit that point right at their perihelion, and it sort of stabilizes the orbit. It reinforces the position of that orbit, and if it's not quite in that position, it actually brings it back. It's sort of a feedback mechanism that if planets are close enough and they don't fit this pattern, it kind of forces them into that pattern. And we've observed that for many of these extrasolar planet systems that we're discovering. So you look, those moons are almost exactly at 2.0 on the ratio of the periods. The Kepler, the 80th planet system discovered by Kepler, has 5 planets that with almost exactly those ratios. You see 1.5, 2 of them, 3 for one of them, and 1.333. It's almost, 1.350. The TRAPPIST system, likewise, you can see 1.5 here, 1.667, very close, all right? Well, why aren't these exact? All right, they should be exact, shouldn't they? Well, that's because there's a little process called libration, where the perihelion, the closest approach to that planet's orbit, is actually shifting a little bit over time. It rotates, that point rotates around the star a little bit. When you have this orbital resonance, that point shifts a little bit, but if it doesn't line up perfectly, the orbital resonance pulls it back. They call that libration. So these periods for these planets are actually oscillating back and forth around that closest point that keeps these planets aligned in orbital resonance. Orbital resonance, by the way, can also be, and I don't think they use the term, some of these ratios can actually eject planets from their system, eventually destabilizes their orbits. I guess they'd call it orbital distance. Let's see if I have another slide here. Well, that was my last slide. I wanted to throw a few things in there. One of the examples of orbital dissonance they've actually found in the asteroid belt, where it's found that, where'd it go? Got it right here. You look at the concentration of asteroids in the asteroid belt, there's these gaps. And it turns out that these gaps, where there are no asteroids, line up with this orbital dissonance or non-resonance with Jupiter. Jupiter's actually flushing these asteroids out by destabilizing their orbit because they're not in orbital resonance. It's kind of interesting there. Well, what's the next step? When the James Webb Space Telescope is launched next year, what it's going to start doing is it's going to start looking at some of these planets that Kepler has found. And the James Webb Space Telescope has accurate enough instruments where when a planet passes between its host star and our line of sight, they can actually do spectral analysis on the light that's passing through the planet's atmosphere and see what elements are present in the atmosphere of that planet. So that's going to be real interesting because we'll be able to tell whether or not these planets have liquid water in their atmosphere, whether they have, whether they're just gas planets, where they have concentrations of methane or how much nitrogen, how much oxygen. we'll be able to start making these really interesting comparisons with our planet and see how these planets have evolved and how common they are. By the way, we can only see the planets using the transit method if those are precisely aligned with our line of sight. Well, that's by chance. It is estimated that for every planetary system where we detect a transit, there are probably 20 to 100 that we don't see via transit because the orbital plane is not aligned up with our line of sight. And I had some additional links here. One of them was, actually, I have it right here. One of these links talks about orbital resonance, and it's got a really neat graphic on Wikipedia, and you can see it here. And this shows 3 planets going around the star, and you can see it flash when they line up at precise points. At the same point in the orbit, when they line up, you'll see them flash. And that's where the point of orbital resonance is occurring.
Should we show this NASA thing or
Oh, I'm sorry, you did have that video too. So let's go ahead and show the rest of it there, and I'll go ahead and take a seat.
Excuse me, John, how far is this TRAPPIST system from Earth?
39.5 light years. Did I skip
So
that slide?
almost 40 light years. Did you
Yeah.
see it already?
That's right, about 39.5 light years. I don't think I pointed it out on the slide,
Right.
one of the slides. Okay,
So let's put
Take
this
it
up.
away.
And remember, part of the moment of science is that it's like there's cross-fertilization or what they call translational things. How much information they can extract from these little dips in light in the curve and so forth. And also the fact that the star's was only found in 1999. It's only 39 light years away. We didn't even know it was there before 1999. Think how that applies in our everyday life. All the things that are going on that we just missed because we weren't paying attention or didn't know how to look. And that many things in our lives too, a lot more information can be extracted about that, especially from other people. You know, people form first impressions of others, and boom, then that's what they are forever. Keep observing in your life everything that's going on, and be willing to find new things. Realizing that there are new things. You really have missed stuff. And if you go through life thinking, oh yeah, I know it all, this is dumb, this is great, whatever, that's not learning. And in other words, think about the opposite of what they call confirmation bias.
Imagine a place with not 1, not 2, but 7 Earth-sized planets all orbiting a single star. It's not just science fiction, thanks to a new discovery by NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope. TRAPPIST-1, an ultra-cool dwarf star just under 40 light years away, plays host to this incredible collection of planets. In 2016, astronomers using the TRAPPIST telescope at the La Silla Observatory in Chile first identified 3 Earth-sized planets here. The discovery warranted extensive follow-up by Spitzer, whose infrared detectors are particularly sensitive to the cool glow of this tiny star. Spitzer devoted over 21 days of nearly continuous observations to TRAPPIST-1, pausing only to send data back to Earth. It was looking for tiny dips in the star's brightness when the circling planets pass in front of the star or transit. From this extensive data set, astronomers confirmed 2 of the 3 previously reported planets and found the third was really 3 different ones. Plus it discovered 2 more for a total of 7. The transits tell us a lot about these planets, including their size, orbital period, distance from the star, and for some of them, their approximate mass and density. NASA's Hubble Space Telescope followed up by studying the transits to look for the chemical fingerprint of hydrogen gas in the exoplanet atmospheres. While its search continues, none has been found yet, adding support to the idea these are all rocky terrestrial worlds. That makes this a planetary system that is both familiar yet exotic. It is likely most, if not all, of these planets perpetually keep one face pointed toward their star, a phenomenon called tidal locking. This would create large temperature gradients across their surfaces and offer the possibility that liquid water could exist on any of them under the right conditions. Moreover, if you could stand on the surface of one of these worlds and look up at your neighboring planets in the sky, they would at times appear larger than our moon looks to us. That's because TRAPPIST-1 is only a little bigger than Jupiter, and the TRAPPIST-1 planets orbit only a little farther apart than Jupiter's moons. Interplanetary trips here would be measured in days, not months or years like in our solar system. For now, we can only speculate what these exoplanets might be like, as we still know relatively little about them. Upcoming missions like the James Webb Space Telescope will study the TRAPPIST-1 system in greater detail and uncover more clues about the atmospheres and compositions of these 7 Earth-sized worlds.
So, always lots of things when it comes to science as to considering what new things we know, and then also the lessons that the science has to teach us about making sense of our day-to-day lives. So, we use, it's the same method of observation, fact gathering, and then trying to make sense of those facts in science as in our everyday lives, except in all of our lives, each one of us is the only one that has access to the data, so to speak. So, I know we're probably going to run late on time, but let's plunge ahead with our subject of the month. There's material today in today's bulletin on heresy as an historical subject. It's very interesting. The bulletin mentions the early Christian heresy of Arianism, which even today you can find just things saying that this was a horrendous threat to Christianity, almost destroyed Christianity at the start, blah, blah. Just total hogwash. Why would it have destroyed Christianity if it had been accepted or even been allowed to suppose that Jesus was not of the same substance as God the Father? I mean, how and why did it matter so much in the 4th century to believe that Jesus was begotten, not made, which is part of the Nicene Creed? It's like, what? I think there was a far more interesting heresy, Manichaeism, and that was incorporated, this idea was incorporated in many of the Gnostic sects early on, which it was an obvious idea, really, that seems obvious from the Bible, that the Old Testament deity is an evil and hateful being who made and rules over the earth, and that Jesus was sent by a good and loving deity from this wonderful kingdom of heaven beyond the world. And this dualistic belief was also apparently held by the Cathars of the 12th to 14th centuries in southern France and northern Italy. During the Crusades to exterminate the Cathars, not all the Crusades were about reclaiming the Holy Land, a guy named Arnaud Aumary, a Cistercian abbot and a military commander, this is where this famous saying comes from. He was asked by one of his troops, how could they tell the Cathars from the Catholics? I mean, they were indistinguishable, and his famous reply was, "Kill them all, the Lord knows his own." Of course, the winners always write the history books, yet even completely unbiased scholars, back up to that, cannot know. I mean, how would you know what things had turned out differently? How might history have turned out if it had been believed from the start that Jesus was not begotten? One of these things, I think, is the Docetism or Sabellianism also had the idea that Jesus' body was an illusion. It was, you were just made to think that. How Star Trek-y. Or that he was an ordinary person into which the Spirit of God possessed him, like the opposite of a demon possession, a God possession. What if Manichaeanism or Gnostic dualism had become the predominant form of Christianity? What if Constantine had not taken an interest in Christianity and taken sides among its diverse elements and insisted that it hammer out a specific creed and doctrines and a discipline? Well, these are the road not taken wonderings. In fact, someone last month, perhaps prompted by that Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, suggested on their evaluation form that we consider this other poem of Frost, The Road Not Taken. And I think we will do that. It's a great idea. The contingencies of history are definitely food for thought. As it happened, many of the Christian heresies about Jesus that were rejected at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century were incorporated 2 centuries later in Muhammad's new religion of Islam. And many people do speculate that Islam arose because the Roman Empire had adopted this Christian monotheism, and out of the fringes they wanted their own version of that. So here's this next slide. This is the guy, Peter Berger, and this is partly why we're talking about the subject of heresy today. He's a Boston University professor emeritus of religion, sociology, and theology. He's considered one of the foremost scholars in this field, and this book that he wrote here on the left-hand side, The Heretical Imperative, it's a real treat. It explores this idea that in a religiously pluralistic society, there is a necessity. You have to choose. There are all these different religious options, and even if you were born into one of them, when you become aware of there being alternatives, that you are faced with this decision. And this is so appropriate because the word heresy actually comes from the Greek word heresis, which means choice or a thing chosen. Berger and many other sociologists of religion that turn out situate the modernization of the world as the background for the collapse of traditional societies where no one had to make choices and could hardly conceive of things being any other way. Berger gives the example in traditional Muslim societies. 5 times a day in Muslim communities, the call to prayer is sounded from 1,000 minarets. Remember, President Obama said that was the prettiest sound on earth. It marks the passage of the hours, and by the same token, the passage of days that make up an individual's biography, and it ensures in the most palpable way possible that the tradition it proclaims serves as a continuous background of the human lives that take place in its hearing. In a community as yet untouched by the relativizing forces of modernization, as was argued earlier, he talks about this in his book, the tradition thus proclaimed possesses a taken-for-granted authority. The subjective correlate of this authority is inner certainty. As the proclamation of God's majesty and of Muhammad's prophethood is issued from the minaret, there takes place an inner antiphony in the minds of those who hear it. Yes, it is so, and it can be no other. Indeed, it may be said that this antiphony between external and internal affirmation is the very essence of existence in a traditional society. I had to look up the word antiphony. This is a style of response singing. So he's saying that in traditional societies, the external cues, like the call to prayer 5 times a day, 5 times a day, think of that. Those are the external cues in your surroundings, and the way that people have been taught to perceive and regard their world, they echo and reinforce one another. Every city and town and region on the earth was once like this, just think of that. But as people increasingly came into contact with one another, as different cultures and different ways of living encountered others, the world shrunk and everything changed. Traditional ways of living could no longer be a default. Even when people stick with the tradition they know, they also have an inescapable awareness that this is in some sense a choice, that it could be different. Berger writes, modernity, and this is a key passage I thought, modernity has plunged religion into a very specific crisis, characterized by secularity to be sure, but characterized more importantly by pluralism. In the pluralistic situation, for reasons that are readily visible to historical and social scientific observation, the authority of all religious traditions tends to be undermined. Maybe that's why they didn't like these deviations from what they wanted to be settled doctrine, because they want people to be aware of choices. In this situation, there are 3 major options or possibilities for those who would maintain the tradition. They can reaffirm the authority of the tradition in defiance of the challenges to it. They can try to secularize the tradition. They can try to uncover and retrieve the experiences embodied in the tradition. I call these 3 options respectively deduction, reduction, and induction. Only the 3rd option, that of the inductive approach, is finally viable. I further contend that the contestation between the major world religions, particularly between the traditions emanating from the religious history of Western Asia, right, the Abrahamic religions, and the traditions given birth on the Indian subcontinent, should be a centrally important theme for theology and religious thought in the future. I think this offers an important insight into what's happening in parts of the world that have not lived with the heretical imperative for as long as we have in the West, and especially in the United States, especially as Berger points out in Western Asia, where the Muslims hear this call to prayer, and they're, despite the modern technology, they're really struggling to maintain this traditional society. And it is clearly a very specific crisis, as he calls it, one that embroiled, think about what it did in Europe, it embroiled Europe in centuries of violence and bloodshed when Europe encountered this. Berger then goes on through and discusses each of the broad categories that he calls options or possibilities. One, as he said, the first one is to assert that a tradition, that you just pick your tradition, that's a truth of reality, that is right, and all the others are wrong, and then to deduce everything from that. As Berger points out, anyone who does this is still subject to the modern context of religious pluralism, as much as this neo-orthodox position, there is neo-orthodoxy, can be done with the Bible, it can be done with the Vatican's traditions, it can be done with the Koran or any other religious tradition. And asserting that a leap of faith is necessary is not sufficient, as Berger says at the end of the quote here. And he's talking about Karl Barth. Apparently he was the big neo-orthodoxy guy in Europe. asserts that Christianity as religion is also unbelief. Indeed, Christianity as a human religious phenomenon is the most dangerous unbelief of all because of its resemblance to true Christianity as Barth. But the violence of Barth's repudiation of the problem posed by the non-Christian religions is a necessary consequence of his method. They have to screen it out, deny it, and ignore it. And as soon as that problem is allowed into the theological universe of discourse, the a priori objectivity of the neo-Orthodox position begins to collapse. For at that very moment, it is no longer clear in which direction, that is, toward which tradition one is supposed to leap. Right? Leap of faith, but which one? Berger doesn't discuss it, but this is undoubtedly the motivation behind this schizophrenic claim of some that their own religion is actually not a religion. Some Christians say this, for example. They say Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with God. They're trying to remove it from the arena of all their competitors. So they would have it believe that their religious tradition is something more real than any other religion, something reflecting the very fabric of reality that puts it above and beyond the category of religion, among which there are so many to choose, of course. And you can find examples of this in Islam, too, where imams and Islamic clerics say, oh, Islam's not a religion. Berger's second option, or possibility he calls reductive, he gives the example which we most readily recognize of the claim that Christianity is really just all about ethics. Remember the Jefferson Bible where he clipped out all the supernatural stuff and just left, the ethical teachings. Jesus then just becomes a great moral teacher and all that embarrassing supernatural business, you can ignore that. But it could also be said, and it has been said, that Christianity is really all about something else, such as social justice, or reforming economic and political institutions, or improving the lives of the poor and downtrodden. And of course we see what did the televangelists, so many of them say, that Christianity is really all about personal success. That's the prosperity theology, or the gospel of success. Show faith and send me your money, and God will make you rich. Of course, one of the problems with the reductive approach is that you're really doing away with many elements of the Christian tradition that don't relate to and are not necessary to what it's really all about. And that reduces its distinctiveness. And one can assent, after all, to the great moral teachings of Jesus without Jesus. So, really the tradition then becomes irrelevant. Think and grow rich, that's not especially Christian either. And the third option or possibility, which Berger thinks is best, he calls inductive. And this approach, he says, was developed initially by the late 18th, early 19th century German theologian and philosopher Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher. I'm sure you've all read him, right? Schleiermacher. Well, as a young man, this guy wrote his father. So he was studying to become a cleric, and he became a cleric, and he wrote his father. He says, I cannot believe that he who called himself the Son of Man was the true eternal God. I cannot believe that his death was a vicarious atonement. So his approach is an attempt to recover a religious tradition beginning with its roots. And here's how Berger puts it. Every tradition consists of frozen memories, and every questioning of tradition is likely to lead to an effort at unfreezing the memories. This is even true of individuals. An individual has many traditions. Prominent among these are traditions of youth. That's a big part of our life, the foundation of our lives, our youth. Frozen somewhere along the line and then carried over in this fixated state into the later years of life. For example, a long ago love affair is frozen into a limited number of images like the tableau of the mind. Whenever the individual thinks of these events in the past or talks about them, it is these few images that are evoked in ritual fashion. Then, something happens to put this construction in question. It no longer fits a new self-definition, or somebody comes up with a different version, or worst of all, the long-lost love reappears in the flesh and forces the terrible question, how could I ever have been in love with this person? And at that point, the individual becomes interested in taking tradition apart, and looking at the evidence, old letters say, or other written sources, or the recollection of witnesses who are still around. In other words, the individual is now embarked on an enterprise of trying to uncover the experiences that, long ago, came to be embroiled in a tradition of youthful love. Where did that come from? How did it go? How must it have been at that time? Needless to say, this process of tracing a tradition back to the experiences that began it is more complex, but the memories at issue are collective rather than individual ones, and that's where all the religious traditions come from, right? But the fundamental enterprise is the same. There will be, above all, the urge to find out how it really was. Modern situation inevitably puts tradition in question and by the same token releases an immense curiosity to find out how it really was. The so-called subjectivism and empiricism of modern thought, its fascination with consciousness and with experience thus has an inevitable dimension of history. And this is exactly what we see, don't we? Easter's coming up, there's going to be another Time magazine article, who Jesus really was, these archaeological things and so forth. So this all dovetails perfectly with the critical analysis of the sacred texts and the efforts of archaeologists to better understand what was happening at that time. And those tasks began, not coincidentally, at the beginning of the modern era that Berger's talking about, right? Schleiermacher, late 18th, early 19th century, that's exactly when Thomas Paine was writing his writings, Common Sense, and especially his analysis of the Bible. And that was when religions came under rational scrutiny, not just with a view to finding their ideas ridiculous, which that's still all that somebody can find in them now, but to uncovering their basis in and thereby also their appeal to, and that's the bigger challenge, to human experience. So the inductive approach clearly is also not subject to the exclusivity problem as neo-orthodoxy is. Any religious tradition could be picked apart and studied and probed in this way, and we'd love to see that done with Islam. Doesn't look like many people are doing it yet, because anybody that tries gets killed. But just as any work of human literature, the arts can be considered from the standpoint of its origins, its influences, and the ability to influence and both challenge and satisfy our interests, inclinations, desires, fears, and ambitions. Also evocative of the Joseph Campbell stuff, right? The hero with 1,000 faces, that these stories, it's a, the mono story, the single story. Of course, when religions are made to work more like the sciences, made more subject to rational consideration, even though they remain rooted in a large body of chaotic elements of human experience. And of course, in any experience, once you start picking it apart, it's not quite the same as the experience itself. But still, what else can you do? It's imperfect, but that's the only choice. But there's still the idea of which ideas from which traditions to pick and choose. That's going to be the case even when we get to work on Islam and other religions. Although happily, one can always go back to the buffet and choose again. So the final point of this idea of the heretical imperative is that we are all heretics now. How are we doing on time? I think we're probably running out. 30. So I do have more material. In fact, there's a lot more material that would fit under the heading of heresy. Anybody have to go right now? Okay. Subject has much to do, obviously, with religious liberty and with religious persecution. And as we know, there are those in our own country who insist that it's religious persecution to require a merchant or professional to provide their goods and services without regard to the beliefs and practices of their customers. But somehow, I don't think that these same people would be okay with anyone refusing to serve or sell to Christians. So we have problems right here at home. But it is worse, much worse in other countries. One important sign is whether a nation criminalizes blasphemy. At last count a few years ago, 32 countries had such laws. 87 had anti-hate speech laws covering defamation of religion or inciting hatred based on religion. And surprise, these laws tend to be in nations where people and their institutions have not been dealing well with modernity. And it turns out, this was actually mentioned in the January bulletin, that the federal government monitors the status of religious liberty around the world through the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. If you Google International Religious Freedom, the first hits are all of that material, including annual reports and information like this. This shows in yellow, there are local restrictions, I guess mainly in Australia and Britain, about being able to say nasty things about religion. The orange, there are some fines and restrictions. Look at that, Canada.
I'm surprised about Canada.
Isn't that surprising?
Are these laws that are enforced or just on the books?
Good question. You'd have to really kind of
Yeah.
dig into it and see how many cases there. But they, even when a law is on the books and not enforced, it deters. The red is where there are prison sentences. So, as you might expect, mainly these countries, the Muslim majority, and the dark red-brown, like Saudi Arabia, Eritrea, Iran. If you say something bad about Muhammad, that's a death sentence. So here's this, and they put out an annual report, quite interesting, and it's all available for free. There are 23 countries where Islam is declared the state religion. Those are Afghanistan, Algeria, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Brunei, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Libya, Malaysia, Maldives, Mauritania, Morocco, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Tunisia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. The Commission lists countries of particular concern. Surprisingly, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, is not on the list, even though human rights groups are now advising that, okay, so there's those countries listed out. Human rights groups are now advising that women visiting Dubai or elsewhere in that country not reported if they're raped because, well, here's the countries of particular concern from the USCRIF. So a similar kind of thing. The blue, there are some restrictions. They didn't include Canada, but that's the U.S. government, which, by the way, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is a nonpartisan, bipartisan. It's not controlled by the State Department or the current or past administration. But there's a situation in the UAE. The latest case involves the arrest of a 25-year-old woman who was on holiday in Dubai in October. She was allegedly attacked by two British men who befriended her and lured her to their hotel room before pinning her down and raping her while recording it with their phone. When the woman reported the rape, she was arrested for breaking Emirati laws against extramarital sex, while her attackers flew back to the UK. Her passport has been confiscated. She's prohibited from leaving the country, kind of under country arrest, stuck down there while she awaits legal proceedings against her. The prescribed punishments for extramarital sex in the UAE include imprisonment, deportation, floggings, and stoning. Isn't that special, as the church lady would say? This is from the U.S. State Department site. A lot of information there. You've already paid for it. Lots of interesting stuff for free on the government sites. And it has country-by-country descriptions of what the situations are there. For the UAE, the report says that under the Sharia judicial system, Muslim men may marry non-Muslim women who are either Christian or Jewish, people of the book, as they say. Muslim women are not permitted to marry non-Muslim men. Non-Muslim men and Muslim women who marry are subject to arrest, trial, and imprisonment on grounds of engaging in extramarital sex. We just saw what they'll do here for that. Minimum sentence of a year in jail. In the event of a divorce between a Muslim father and a non-Muslim mother, the law grants child custody to the Muslim father. So this information is somewhat limited, and at least on the State Department, probably possibly adjusted somewhat to serve U.S. diplomatic purposes, but still very useful. And as I've said, you already paid for it. So that really is all we have time for today. How much interest is there in coming back to this sort of thing? It's kind of depressing in a way.
It's interesting about Muslim law, Sharia law, and all
Yeah.
that.
Of course, what's the big deal if a couple of Muslims in the United States have a dispute and they want to settle it according to Sharia? Fine, let them go to their imam and solve their dispute. There shouldn't be anything stopping that. But certainly punishing people with stoning and flogging because Muhammad said so, that doesn't make any sense. And the same thing is true of Catholic canon law. There are people that write a will and they say, okay, this or that in my estate is going to be settled by Catholic canon law. Who's to stop that? That's just personal choice. So anyways, as I always plead, think about it. Lots to think about, I hope. Enough for at least the rest of the week, if not the rest of the month. We see you in April. And these are probably the most important slides of all. Freethought is not free. We do pay for the hotel and the other goodies, the website, and everything that we do. But no person makes any money on this. It's all a labor of love. And get involved. I think you'll love it too. Always need volunteers, as I pointed out earlier. And there's plenty of reason to give us your money. We're so appreciative of those of you who do. You're doing together what none of us can do on our own. We can all sit home watching YouTube videos, but then there are things that we do as an organization that just none of us, not even me, I can't just do it on my own. Help us promote your values and demonstrate your commitment and be the future that you want to see, like Gandhi said. Did you have a
I was wondering, are you aware of the 9 CDs available, Joe Campbell interviews by Bill Moyer?
Oh yes, that there were some interviews that Bill Moyers did with Joseph
Available
Campbell.
online.
Yeah, those are probably on YouTube, huh?
I don't know that.
Could be. But Joseph Campbell, I think, is dead now.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So
96 years.
great tradition of writings about, kind of the emotional, psychological meaning of a lot of these stories that are incorporated in the Bible and other religious books. The Hindus actually have a ton of stuff about all these interesting stories. And of course, they're all about kings and mythology. Yeah. All right, so we'll meet 4 weeks from today, talk about why should we be reasonable? That's a pretty important question, I think, for those of us who think that reason is important. Well, why? Why should we do that? What's wrong with just making that leap of faith and believing in stuff that nobody in their right mind would believe? Oh, can you read the cartoon there?
Yeah, right.
Can you read it in the back there? The one turkey saying to the other, "Be reasonable, Frank. If he wanted us dead, why would he feed us so much?" The other one saying,